My talk today will mainly focus on this part here about the Thermochronology laboratory, which I helped to install. The first microscope we got set up in the new renovated labs in 2012, but now we have 2 microscopes, 2 Olympic microscopes with the digital cameras, automated XY stage and so on. This is exactly the same setup that I have in my laboratory in Grenoble, and the same setup that we have installed also at the Université, at EAFIT University in Medellin, which allows us to basically treat samples, train people in any of these 3 labs for cross-calibration and comparisons. So this is what I'm going to mainly talk about today. We also, since 2014, have a laser ablation ICP-MS laboratory for, at the moment, mainly uranium lead dating on zircon. We have a Thermo scientific element 2 ICP-MS and a photon machine examiner laser. We want to extend this with a quadrupole ICP-MS in the future that we connect to the same system. But we have a presentation by Mari Peña later on that will talk a little bit more about this laboratory here, and also the newest acquisition that we have as the scanning electron microscope, where we can use cathodoluminescence and EDS analysis. And the cathodoluminescence is, of course, very important for imaging zircons before we do uranium analysis, so we can actually see zoning, etc. So Mari is also talking a little bit about this. The next thing we want to do is the C14 dating facility, which is currently in installation. So we will have to talk about this in the future, events. So but what is the reason why we want to do thermochronologic research or geochronologic research here in Bogota with the Geological Survey? And you can see on this diagram here, there's a whole range of different dating techniques that exist to study the thermal history or the crystallization history of rocks. So at the moment, what we can do is, as I said, the lead dating of the zircon, the fission track dating of zircon and apatites. And scientific interest in most laboratories around the world is to look at the relationships maybe between tectonics, climate, and surface processes, which has been a large sector of research in the last 10, 20 years. Exhumation studies like to find out how mountain belts have been eroded and exhumed over millions of years, and maybe to do time temperature history modeling. So the important thing is we can use these techniques actually to quantify geological processes. And this is very important if we want to understand really how the Earth systems work. You know, it's very important to get information on rates of exhumation, rates of erosion, the rates of cooling of rocks, and then to implement them in our modeling to understand the systems. So, for example, to study geodynamic evolution of mountain belts and sedimentary basins, to look at the formation of hydrocarbons, coal bed methane, and to do provenance studies, maybe in basins, for dating of volcanic activity, to understand how volcanic regions work, and maybe also the formation of ore deposits. So the idea of thermochronology, because it's time in the chronology in thermo for temperature, is if we collect samples from an outcrop, from a mountain, or if I take a rock there and I analyze it with the fission track methods, for example, I can deduce the history of how they cool down, because these dating techniques, fission track dating, and as is shown here, uranium therm helium dating, these dating techniques are sensitive to different kinds of temperatures. And if we have a simple cooling history, now when the rock is just cooling down because it's been exhumed towards the surface by erosion or by normal faulting, we can, when I analyze the sample, I can determine at which time this rock has passed to the different isotherms that are associated with what we call the closure temperature. The closure temperature is one of the fundamental concepts for interpreting these kind of rocks. And then we can, of course, also work with detrital sediments, like from modern rivers here, that what a river sample, basically the river will sample the landscape for me. It will have cranes, zircons, and apatites that come from different part of the drainage area. And if I analyze this river sample, analyze like about 100 cranes or something, I can get an overview about the cooling ages that I have in my drainage area. And I can relate this, I can use this to determine rates of exhumation. And of course also I can study with ancient sedimentary rocks, things that have been, sediments that have been deposited in the sedimentary basins next to the mountains. And if I use the higher temperature system like zircon fission track, which has a disclosure temperature of about 240 degrees, that is resistant for reheating, I can study maybe the long-term exhumation of these mountain belts. And if I use fission track dating on apatites, which has a lower sensitivity to temperature, I may actually be able to study the thermal history of the basin itself, because the closure temperature, as I will show you here, now the two fundamental concept that we use for interpreting the thermochronologic data is this closure and the partial annealing zone concepts. So as I said, the closure temperature works very well if we have a very simple cooling history, monotonic cooling, and the closure temperature itself depends primarily on the rate how fast it is cooling. Now, we usually use this one temperature, 240 or 120 degrees, but in reality, it depends on how fast this is cooling. But for most orogenic systems that cool at about 10, 15 degrees Celsius per million years, these temperatures of 240, 120 work quite well. But as I said, in reality, it's not just one simple temperature. It's actually temperature range over which this closure or reopening occurs, and this is what we define as, for fission track dating, as the partial annealing zone, for helium dating as the partial retention zone. And this is more important for rocks or for minerals that have complex cooling histories, like cooling, reheating, and cooling afterwards, associated with burial in a basin or with volcanic activity that could cause reheating. And that depends on the temperature actually achieved and for how long these minerals have been in these temperature ranges. I just want to show this with two graphics. In this graph here, we have the temperature and we have the time. So from high temperatures to low temperatures, from the past towards the present. And we can see this red line here, which is indicates the cooling curve. And as long as my mineral, for example, my zircon here, is at temperatures above 240 degrees Celsius, all the fission tracks that are formed, and fission tracks are formed by spontaneous fission of uranium-238. Normally, uranium-238 would decay to lead-206, but for 1 million uranium isotopes that are decaying normally, there's one that will fission spontaneously, will cause a damage in the crystal structure, and that will be my fission track. However, as the temperature is high, this damaged zone will be rapidly annealed and healed. But if the temperature is low, when my rock is cooling, eventually I will start retaining these fission tracks in the crystal structure. And they will accumulate over time in my crystal. So if I take a sample today and I analyze how many tracks I have in there, and I know the uranium concentration in this place, I can calculate actually or project at which time this closure has occurred. And if I assume a thermal gradient, I can say, okay, which depth this may have been and what has been the rate of exhumation since the closure of the system. So as I said, this works well for monotonic cooling. On the other side, we have this partial annealing zone concept. And this is shown here for apatites because it was mainly developed in the studies of apatite fission tracks. If we assume that we have our apatite that was exhumed here, has then eventually been eroded, transported, and deposited in the basin. When it's being buried, it may re-enter temperatures where these fission tracks start to anneal. This is this partial annealing zone. And it's basically defined as the temperature range where we have between 10% annealing and 90% annealing, kind of a convention for this. So it means our apatite has already accumulated fission tracks from its previous history, and now because of burial heating, these fission tracks will start to faint. Of course, during this time, it will also produce new fission tracks, but they also will be affected by this annealing. So eventually, we will reach temperatures. If we have samples from down here, technically, if we analyze them, we will get a 0 H, basically something that has completely annealed and has no fission track cooling edge. Only if we would exhume this again, then we could the tracks that are forming then would be retained in the system. And this concept has been used widely, particularly in the oil industry, as I will show later on in another graph, and because this temperature range here for full annealing is very close to the peak of oil production, or the oil maturation, I should say, in sedimentary basins. So if we combine these different techniques, the fission track dating on zircons and apatites from the mountains, if you, for example, collect samples from an H elevation profile here, or as I go to the next slide, oops, you can see this is a little bit bigger. So if you collect samples from the H elevation profiles, we can study the history here. We can study the detrital samples from the modern rivers and from the basins to either get long-term exhumation histories or the thermal history of the basin itself. The other thing we can also use, especially when combine this now with uranium lead dating, we can study also the formation of ore deposits. Now, for example, the idea about the crystallization of a host rock or the cooling history of the host rock associated or next to the veins where the actual ore deposits are formed. Well, we come back to this in a minute. Okay. So my collaboration, as I said, started in 2010. I was invited by the Geological Survey to come here to give a short course on thermochronology in November, and it was a very nice success. But the reason why this all started is because the ANH, the Agencia Nacional de Hidrocarburos, started this program for the development of research laboratories in Colombia. Now, the research laboratories were looking for partners in either in the United States, in Europe, or Australia, or different parts of the world. So I had the luck that I was contacted by Professor Gloria Toro in Medellin, who was also interested in modernizing their fission track laboratory. And the reason for this was because Gloria had done her PhD in Grenoble in the 1990s, and so she contacted me as the responsible for the fission track lab in Grenoble to ask for this collaboration. And I was very happy to accept this because I had a great interest in working in Colombia. So we did this in 2010. In the fall, we decided about how to renovate maybe the laboratory space that is available at the Geological Survey to install a fission track lab. We got the first microscope in 2011, but we had to wait until I came back in 2012 to finalize the installation when the lab were renovated or the renovations were finished. In the meantime, there's a little mistake. Actually, this congress, we did the first thermochronology session in 2011, not in 2012. And we continued doing sessions at different congresses in 2013, 2015 to kind of start to build up a thermochronology community here, not only in Colombia, but throughout Latin America. The thing is also, since 2012, we have been continuously training students and researchers. So every time I come to the Geological Survey, I usually give a seminar for training new people and to advance things. I had also people come to my lab in Grenoble to work, including students not only from Bogota and the Geological Service, but also from Medellin, where we have an exchange program. The next big step forward was, of course, in 2014, the laser ablation dating system and the scanning electron microscope, because all these are complementing our capacities for doing thermo and geochronological research. Okay. This is moving. So what was important for me, going back, nope, kind of confused, sorry for that. Okay, it's a little slow. So the important thing was for this whole development, if you want to learn how to use thermochronology, again, okay, is to do all the steps correctly. Thermochronology research starts first, of course, with the planning of the project. We want to know what is the objective, and this is where we then design the sampling. Now, how do we go in the field? How many samples do you want to take? What kind of lithology should we sample? So on. So the first thing we did in 2013, I had the opportunity to use a sabbatical leave where I was here for 6 months, that we could actually go out with different groups, especially the basic geosciences and the thermochronology group together, to do sampling a profile. And we sampled a profile between Bogota and Villavicencio. And the reason for this is because this had already been studied by Mauricio Parra, and that we could actually relate our results to something that has already been done to basically as a kind of a check, right? So we went together into the field, and we paid a lot of attention to what kind of rocks should we sample, because not all lithologies are very useful for this, depending if they have zircons or apatites in them. The grain size is important because very fine grained rocks we cannot really use because we need sufficiently large crystals to do the fission track dating. And so we sampled bedrock samples, and we also did modern river samples. And the important thing is when we do the sampling is also to look what other information do we have in the field. Now, for example, in the river, look at what kind of lithologies are already present there, because that give us additional information. Now, we're not going to go out to do thermochronology, we go out to do geological research. So we take all the information that we can get. So this is the first step. After the first step of the sampling is, of course, the mineral or the sample preparation, which includes First of all, crushing, sieving, and separating the apatites and zircons, which are heavy minerals. So we use standard mineral separation techniques here in the laboratory of the Geological Survey for hydraulic separation, for magnetic and density separations. So once we have the apatite and zircon aliquots, we can mount them, apatites in epoxy and zircons in Teflon, and we etch them. The apatite etching is very simple in a 5.5 molar HNO3 solution at 21 degrees Celsius for 20 seconds. This is a standardized technique that basically all the labs around the world use. The zircon fission track aging is much more complicated. It needs hours of etching and control of every single sample after each etching step, and they're etched in a solution of sodium potassium hydroxide at about 228 degrees Celsius. And so there's a little bit of experience used, and this is why many fission track labs in the world only use apatites, but we are here, we're also doing zircons, which is a very powerful technique. So the next step, of course, after we have the samples ready, we have to analyze them. And there's two techniques that can be used for fission track analysis. This is the more classical technique, it's called the external detector method. There the samples will be irradiated in a nuclear reactor with thermal neutrons. So we can get a way to determine the uranium concentration in the area where we have analyzed the fission tracks. Or we can use a laser ablation ICP-MS system. In that case, we would only need to count tracks in the crystal, image the area where we have counted it, and then reanalyze the same area with a laser ablation system. This is one thing we are working on at the moment, that we want to establish this technique as well. So far, we only have used the external detector method for the Geological Survey, but pretty soon we will use the laser ablation fission track dating. So we have been cross-analyzing the samples in Bogota, in Medellin, and in Grenoble, and we came up with very comparable results. Doesn't matter where I am counting the samples, where other people from the Geological Survey counting the samples, or whoever counts the samples, we get the same results. This is very encouraging. So this works quite well. So the last step, of course, where we are now, is after we have the data, is to do, of course, the data interpretation and the modeling, and finally the publications. So we want to use these fission track data or thermochronologic data to do, for example, time temperature history modeling, as is shown in this widely used program. It's called HEFTI from Richard Ketchum in Texas, where we can discern maybe thermal histories like in a sedimentary basin. Or we can do statistical analysis of the grain age distributions that we have in samples and use this for provenance information, etc., studying exhumation. So we have reached this fourth step now here. So we have basically all the expertise developed to do serious fission track and thermochronologic analyses. And of course, the next step to do is then the more advanced P-cube modeling, where we do basically three-dimensional models of the thermal evolution of the crust and how this is associated with exhumation. Now, this is an example from Mauricio Bermuda's work in Venezuela, where we have collected samples from age elevation profiles, one that was published, one that was done new, and then we can use this code to basically determine exhumation rates. Now, there's different exhumation scenarios for the different blocks to the left and the right of the Bocono fault in that example. But we can easily apply this as well to areas like the Santander Massif or the Eastern Cordillera, etc. So this is the level we're at now. So the interest of the Geological Survey to do this kind of research, of course, is in large part related to the resources that we have in Colombia. And in this diagram, I want to show you that how we can combine, of course, now fission track dating with other techniques, because we should not just use this as one single approach and only that information. Geology is more complex, so we need more information. And as you can see here, this is the fission track partial annealing zone that I talked about before, in relation to, for example, wittenite reflectance data. So this is an independent information on temperature that we can use to constrain the thermal history of a basin. Equally, in addition, we could use, for example, illite crystallinity analysis from finer grained materials in our rocks, where the crystallinity of the illite will also increase with temperature. And we can relate this as well with the wittenite reluctance and the apatite fission track information, especially the track length measurements maybe that we can do in the apatites. And as you can see in this diagram, that this partial annealing zone of the apatites, as I said before, the lower limit where we get full annealing in the apatite fission tracks corresponds basically to the main temperature range of oil maturation in sedimentary basins. And we can also relate this, of course, to the grade of coal that we may find in these basins, which is, of course, an interesting aspect here in Colombia. So it's very important in an integrated basin analysis study to combine this with other diagenetic information. Also, fluid inclusion analysis is very important because that gives us another independent temperature constraints on the moment of these formations. So all this will go into the modeling of the thermal history of basins. And also we can, of course, look at the annealing, especially the total annealing of fission cracks in zircon. The other aspect, and the reason why we have now this uranium-lead dating lab and the fission crack DAG is to do actually double dating on single grains. So this is the objective. So that we gain from one crystal a time of from one grain the crystallization age and the cooling age. And there's two reasons for doing this. Now, I've already mentioned this a little bit before. For example, the ore deposits. We can use uranium-lead dating on zircon to determine when a magma has crystallized. And we can, if we use aluminum hornblende barometry, we can actually get an idea in which crustal depth this crystallization occurred. And then we can study maybe with uranium-lead dating on apatite. This is one of the things we want to do in the future here, which has a lower closure temperature than the zircon uranium-lead dating. But it falls into the temperature range here between uranium-lead and the zircon that is usually associated with hydrothermal ore deposit formation. Porphyry, copper, gold, silver, base metals, uranium, whatever you want. So with these analyses, we can basically bracket the range, the temperature range when this happened, and then maybe the other techniques, uranium, thermal, helium, apatite, fission track dating, we can get maybe the exhumation history afterwards. Because what is important for the exploration is that these mineralizations are close to the surface or at the surface, because then it's easier to exploit them, of course. So this combination of these different techniques, basically kind of not only double but almost triple dating, can have a great potential for studying ore deposits. And also for provenance analysis. Now this diagram here from Pete Reiner's, a little bit modified for fission track dating. If I would use only uranium-lead or only fission track dating, I may miss some of the provenance information, but if I use the double dating, I can spread out the signal and I can actually differentiate clearly the different sources as they're shown here in this cartoon. Of course, in reality, this is a bit more complicated as this simple diagram, but this is the basic idea behind it. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the different projects that we are currently working on here in the Geological Survey between the different groups. For example, we have a project on coal bed methane in the Umbida-Rondon basin here. We will hear more about this on Thursday. There will be a presentation by Sergio Amaya about this project. We have a new project that we have just prepared, almost like 100 samples for the Medio Magdalena Valley, also for the study of the thermal history of this basin in relation to coal bed methane. The provenance study, this is from what I want to show you, the modern rivers that we sampled. I'm going to talk about this in a second, and also the Piper volcanism I'm going to present to you. Two new projects that are the one that we have also just prepared the samples for is the Rila Magnesium Exploration Project. We want to study the thermal history of this area. And a very new project we just discussed last week that we want to do is about uranium exploration project in the Santander Massif. So these are things that are currently going on or in development, this one here. Because all these projects go through the same steps. First we come together, we discuss the projects, we plan it, and then we go into the field, do the sampling, etc., and all the other steps until the end. So basically the groups, the different work groups in the Geologic Survey have to collaborate on this to make this very efficient. And this works quite well. So, come on, okay. So I want to show you for this exhumation study, I just want to focus on these modern river samples that we collected. There's one from the Rio Magdalena here in Girardot, and two from two rivers near Villavicencio. And as you can see here, this is the uranium-lead data sets that we have. One's for the Rio Magdalena here, and one for the Rio Guadica near Villavicencio, where you can see that the uranium-lead signals are very different. Now we have this very young, well, relatively young for uranium-lead, peaks here that we are missing on the eastern side of the Eastern Cordillera. So well, that is not surprising because most of this probably comes from the Central Cordillera in this case, and not from the eastern. But the thing is, if we come on, good. If you look at the second river, the Guauribe, we can see that there's a little bit of a difference in the signal. We can see Both come from the Eastern Cordillera, but this one has a tail with older ages here that we need to explain. What is the difference between these two samples? Okay, one difference is we only analyze 50 grains here, so maybe we could argue we are missing this part of the spectrum, but I'll doubt it. The thing is, if we look at the location of these two samples, basically, the blue and the red, we can see the lithology here, and if we look at this Google Earth map, sorry, it's a little bit difficult to see, but the drainage area here of this river cuts deeper into what's called the Kitami Massif. Now, there's a lot more of Precambrian rocks that are exposed there than in the other drainage area, which drains more towards the north here, which mainly samples Cretaceous sedimentary rocks. And this could explain maybe this difference that we see in the tail of older ages in one of the rivers and then in the other. But if we compare our results to check how good are our data, we can compare this to work of Brian Horton, who's going to talk to us, I think, on Thursday. We get basically the same signal. This was the signal that they published in 2010 about the Eastern Cordillera. The ages here between 400 to 500 million years to about, then a big peak here at 1,000 million years in the 1500, 1600. This is the same that we see here as well. Only 50 grains, so we only get a couple of grains here, but it's definitely the same spots that we see along here. And if you look at the signal from the Rio Magdalena, it's the same spectrum that he found here, except that we have this little bit of this tail, maybe a little contribution. There's a little bit older here that may come from the Eastern Cordillera. But in general, this works. Our results are the same that has been produced in other labs around the world. And this is, of course, good confirmation. Of course, all our analyses are controlled by standard analyses. For every 5 grains, we analyze a standard. But Mari is going to talk about this. If you now look at the circumfission tract data in these samples, we get a different picture. Now, this is the circumfission tract data. We analyzed about 100 grains for this, and you can see we can distinguish statistically different age peaks or age groups, the main grain age populations in these samples. And we just want to focus on the first one, which I call the P1, the first peak, the youngest peak, because this is the most indicative of exhumation in the drainage area, because this comes from these zircons are derived from the areas that exhume the fastest. As you can see here, the youngest peak in the Rio Magdalena is about 33.6 million years, plus or minus 10%. And the youngest peak here from the Rio Guatigua is about 22.5, so it's about 10 million years younger. And if we go now to the other, if I now look at the other river, Guaribe, which drains a larger part of the Kitami Massif, where we found more of these older uranium lead ages, we actually find even younger circumfission tract ages, about 15.5 million years. And if you compare this to published data from Mauricio Parra's work, but they have sampled the Bogotá-Villavicencio profile, we can see this corresponds very nicely. Now, I just want to draw your attention to these numbers here given in red. And you can see where we have the Cretaceous sedimentary cover rocks, where we get an old peak. They just provided here the central age of this, the mean age of the sample, the 136 million years. But if you go further down, basically in the stratigraphic section, we can see that the age is getting younger. Here's like 61, 13 million years, 8 million years. There's something about 9 million years here in the Kitami, another 9 million years. So you can see this stippled line that they put in here. This was how Mauricio Parra interpreted it as the base of the partial annealing zone of the zircons. So everything below has been basically fully reset. Now our river, of course, drains this area, and this is where we get this 15 basically million year peak from. Now this is basically the mixture of these 9, 11, 18 million year old zircons that are then represented as a 15 million year peak here, but you can see this is fairly broad, has a widespread. So our detrital river sample reflects very well what is in the drainage area, what we have from the bedrock ages. But the thing is, for here we have to analyze like 10 samples or more. With my river, I only have to analyze 1 sample. So it's a very good method for prospecting for areas that we don't know yet. This can give us a good overview of what's happening. We can use this information, of course, now to translate this into rates of exhumation, or long-term average rates of exhumation. And there's different ways to calculate and do this. I just want to present this very simple model. It's based on a program by Mark Brandon from Yale University, which is called H2E. It's a very simple one-dimensional thermal advection model. And as you can see here, the relationship between exhumation rate and the fission tract rate depended on a certain set of thermal parameters that I have to put in the beginning, or I assume a thermal gradient, a surface temperature, etc. These 15 to 20 million year circumfission drag ages would correspond to long-term exhumation rates about 0.3, 0.4 kilometers per million years. These are not outrageously fast exhumation rates, but comparable maybe to exhumation rates we can find in the Alps in Europe. Of course, the older cover rocks that are recycled with old fission drag ages indicate, of course, very slow exhumation because they're still there. If the exhumation would be faster, they would have been removed by now. So anyway, this is for the zircons. If you look at apatite fission data, unfortunately our river samples didn't have a lot of apatite, so I couldn't do this analysis. But if we look at the bedrock data, we can see that exhumation must have increased at a certain time because Maurizio Parra, Andres Mora, and so on, they found they work much faster exhumation rates later on. Okay, so if you compare the fission drag signals of the two rivers that drain the eastern flank, they are very similar. And we can do KS statistics on this. We can see that they are statistically the same distribution, but if you do the relationship between the Rio Magdalena and the Rio Cotica, we can see that they are significantly different statistically. So, as you would expect, the different mountain ranges make this. So just to conclude for this part of my talk, the zircon lead ages spectra of the Rio Magdalena is younger. We saw the younger ages in the Rio Magdalena than in the signal from the eastern Cordillera. But if we look at the fission drag ages, we actually get the different signal that the younger fission drag ages in the eastern Cordillera than in the Rio Magdalena, and that the ages that we observed are totally comparable to the bedrock fission drag ages by Maurizio Parra. So the long-term affirmation rates are the fastest in this river drainage here, where most of the crystalline rocks are exposed. Of course, we have to remove the cover to get to the crystalline rocks below. Okay, I want to now switch to the Paiba-Itza volcanic complex as another example of the research that we have been doing in cooperation with other groups in the geochemistry group in the Geological Survey. And the Paiba-Itza volcanic complex is a little complex located here about 130 kilometers northeast of Bogota, which we have here in the eastern Cordillera. And this has been studied in the past mainly by Pardo et al. Published in 2005. And they used argon-argon and potassium-argon dating to confine the volcanic activity between 2.5 and 1.9 million years. So what is the Paiba-Itza today? We have strong thermal activity in this area. We have the Poço Azul thermal spring, which has a temperature of about 73 degrees Celsius. We have CO2 gas seepages that we can see in the area, in certain areas where the CO2 comes out of the ground. We have a local geothermal gradient that was determined at about 74 degrees Celsius per kilometer. That means there must be still a source of hot rock or magma chamber somewhere at depth. We don't know at which depth. We would need some seismic analysis to actually constrain this, but there must be something going on at depth. So the question is this area still active, or is it just dormant, or has it finished its activity and it's just fumaroles that happen afterwards? We don't know yet. The rocks that have been deposited are mainly alkali, trachytes, and rhyolites, and 2 eruption episodes have been defined by Pardo et al., a caldera collapse and a dome collapse, and 14 different volcanic units have been identified. So as you can see on this map here from the Geological Survey, where they have mapped out in the green colors is all these surrounding Cretaceous sedimentary rocks of the eastern Cordillera. And then we have these different volcanic units that are shown here for this first epoch, and then we have ignimbrites and pumice and ash flow deposits, which belong to what's identified as the caldera collapse. And we have the 7th eruption episode, epoch of the dome collapse, where we have more rhyolites, etc. So we collected fission drag samples from these different units, only actually one from the first eruption period and more from the second one. And one of the surrounding country rocks, actually we tried to get more samples, but this was the only one who actually gave us sufficient, well, not even that one sufficient, but it gave us some zircons to analyze. Anyway, so we want to look at this sample here and a couple of those, and this one to see what is the fission drag signal and the uranium lead signal in these rocks. Come on. Okay, so here is the apatite fission drag, the zircon fission drag data of the Paiba-Itza. So for one of the samples here, from the second eruption episode, we can clearly see the fission track ages have a volcanic age that correspond about 3 million years here. There's a bit of spread in the data, but that's okay. So the average age that we get here is about 3 million years, which falls in close to the range that we've seen before. But the other thing we can see in many of the samples is actually a clear spread between different zircons. We have, for example, in this sample here, we have a bunch of very young zircons at about 1.8 million years, and others at about 260 million years. So this indicates that during the eruption process, the rocks have been incorporated from the country rock and reproduced during the eruption, which is not a surprise, because if we look at the volcanic rocks, the ignimbrites deposited, very often we can find rock fragments from the surrounding country rock. So if we combine all of the 10 samples that we have from the volcanic rocks of these 2 eruption episodes, and we just put them all together and say, what is the signal that we can find? We can see this in this probability density plot where we have, again, the fission track ages here. And we do this statistical analysis to see what are the main age components statistically on these about 209 cranes that have been dated. And you can see we get 2 populations, one at 1.6 and one at 5.7 million years from all the samples. Then a peak at about 54 million years and one at 290 million years. Right? And if you look at the proportion of these peaks, now we can see that about 80% of the zircons that we've analyzed fall into this into these young peaks that we associate with the volcanic activity, and then the other ones come from the recycling. So here is about 5% of the cranes that we consider as being partially reset, and then about 14% that have not been reset at all, or maybe only very little. So why do we say this? Well, for this one sample that we have from the Planers Formation, where we got, well, meager 10 cranes. I know this is not sufficient to really represent the age distribution, but because the separation of the ages is so clear, now we're still going to exploit this sample, even if it's very poor with 10 cranes. But we get a young peak here, which is all about 50 million years, and another one that's about 230 million years, 300 million years, sorry. And the blue line here basically indicates the age of deposition for this formation, which is about, the late Cretaceous, about 83 million years. So we can see this one population here is definitely much younger than the age of deposition, which is an indication for the partial resetting. So the age itself, 54 or 50 million years, has no geological meaning, but it is a good indication that we had a partial resetting. And this one is just the recycled ages. So this is this is how we can attribute that these cranes are partially reset and these ones are non-reset. But a strong volcanic signal that corresponds to these ages. Because as I said, for the fission tracks, you need at least temperatures of like 240 degrees to anneal them completely. And many of these cranes have been in the magma chamber, probably. So if you look at the uranium lead data, we can also get a whole spread, the same thing. We have ages about 3.3 million years here in this sample from the first eruption episode, and then older peaks, not all the way spread out, basically the same range that we saw in the Eastern Cordillera before in the river analyses. And then from the second eruption episode, we get a first peak at about 2 million years, and then we have these older peaks as well. So also in there we have this recycling signal. But the interesting thing is, if we look, where do these ages come from, and we look at our zircons in detail, and this is where the cathodoluminescence analysis becomes very important. So we have, for example, this zircon here. We did 3 spot analyses on this crane, and we see the core is old, 900 million years. We have a metamorphic rim, about 440 million years, which corresponds to one of the metamorphic episodes here in the area. And then we have this last euhedral overgrowth. It's a little bit difficult to see here, but where we get actually these volcanic ages. And it's only in the rims where we find these volcanic ages. It's not in the cores. So we only have zircons that have been recycled, that have been in the magma chamber, and that they got a new overgrowth that corresponds to volcanic activity. While the other ones is older. So with 3 spots, we can get a fairly nice history of this zircon for this. So the important thing is now, it seems that the phase of volcanic activity is between about 5.7, 5.8 to about 1.8 million years, about 4 million years. Now it's much longer than the time that has been determined for with the argon-argon dating. And if you look at this work from Andres Mora, I know it's a little bit to the south of where the Paipa-Itza area is, But we can see these are apatite fission track data from surface outcrops, and that indicate that there was exhumation going on the last 2 to 3 million years. Of course, fission track dating does not give us information about surface uplift directly, but it's a good indication normally, because if we create topography, surface uplift, we start eroding, and that causes exhumation. So it means we had an important phase of exhumation in the Pliocene here, and during this time we had the volcanic activity. While the eastern cordillera was rising, the volcanic activity was going on. The question is, did this volcanic activity contribute to the surface uplift, or is it just passively being uplifted as well? I don't know yet. Well, there's more research that could be done to determine this. So anyway, to conclude this part of the presentation, the volcanic activity, we think, started with the age that we have, the whole spectrum, not at 4, but at 5.9. This is some of the older volcanic ages we found, and lasted at least until about 1.8 million years, 4 million years. We have a strong signal of recycling of country rock that we can see not only in the petrology, but also in the ages of the fission tracks and this uranium lead. We had a moderate effect on the thermal effect on the surrounding rocks, as you could see in this one sample from the sediments. And again, that this activity happened during this phase of Pliocene surface uplift of the eastern cordillera. And then to end, I think here the Geological Survey now has really excellent analytical and data interpretation capacities, where we can have the possibilities for large, or for international collaborations with the Geological Survey or within the Geological Survey, and that this is a basis also we can use for training students, for training the next generation of geoscientists in these techniques, which I think is very important for the research being done in this country. Every year when I come here at the end, I will do my evaluation, I give a recommendation to the director of this of the Geological Survey, Dr. Paredes. My recommendation for this year is continue complementing the existing dating capacities, adding, for example, uranium thorium helium dating and argon dating to extend our spectrum on the dating techniques that we can use. And this would of course also mean that the Geological Survey has to hire more geologists who actually work with these techniques, because it's very important that there is the geological knowledge behind doing these analyses. So for me, these 6 years of research here with the service have been very, very interesting, very large pleasure to work with the people here. And I think these 100 years of geologic research here were not 100 years in solitude. No, this is 100 years in collaboration and in friendship. And with this, thank you very much, and feliz cumpleaños para el Servicio Geológico. Gracias.
Buenas. ¿Tenemos espacio para preguntas? Andrés. Germán, mira.
Thank you very much for the conference and for the data that you showed in the last 20 minutes. In the last 6 years, you have been working with the groups in Bogota and in Medellin. The question is, which have been the major challenges of working here in Colombia for you?
The major what? Sorry?
Challenges, desafíos.
Challenges. Oh, challenges, sorry. Well, the major challenges, I think everything of these implementations of these laboratories just needs time, right? And fission track dating, something is not done that is quickly. So every step needs to be carefully done. I think overall this worked quite smoothly, right? From having the meetings, deciding about what things we should acquire in the next time. For example, after we had the fission track lab set up, my recommendation was to get the the laser ablation ICMPMS analysis. 1 or 2 years later, we had this installed as well. So the challenges, it may be until now was maybe some of the restrictions in going to the field. But now with the peace process thing going on in this country, this will become a lot easier in the future to go also to other areas that are interesting to work at, that I would like to visit, that have not been possible for me so far. But overall, in some respects, I find it sometimes easier to work here than in France. So for the fission track dating, there's absolutely no problem doing this because we also calibrate this all the time with standards. Now we use Fishken, Durango tough standards for the appetites, and Fishken, Bullock tough standards for the zircons. And we also, routinely, they're always analyzed with every irradiation we do. For the rhenium lead dating, this is done by analyzing every 5 grains. You also analyze the standard, and then you have to control that your analyses are correct, because if you get the right answers for the standards, you can have confidence in your rhenium lead H's. And there as well, as Mari will explain in the next talk, we have been setting up the rhenium lead lab with the help of Jeremy Horrigan from Santa Cruz, and I think Santa Cruz, Santa Barbara, I don't remember. But anyway, there as well, those samples that were analyzed here, we cross-analyze in other labs, and if you get the same results, then we have confidence in this. Because there's no quality certificate for age dating labs. No, that doesn't exist in the world. It's just by the relation. Then we of course we publish this, we get this peer-reviewed, and then it's accepted. So this is the standard procedure as we would use in France, in the US, and in Germany, and so on. It's the same thing. I think Brian can confirm this with the labs he's working with in the United States. If it's done in Arizona and Texas or wherever, it doesn't really matter, because we use the same kind of analytical procedures.
Muchas gracias, Matthias. El Servicio Geológico le hace entrega del símbolo del simposio por su intervención.
Muchas gracias. Gracias.